This is continuing coverage in the trial of Richard Merritt from the Hidden Killers podcast on the True Crime Today network.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, Mr. Burnett.
Good afternoon.
Let's see, Mr. Burnett, back in 2019, you were working for the Cobb County Police Department, correct?
Yes.
And back then you were assigned to the CSI division, correct?
Correct.
Crime scene investigation.
Correct.
Now, CSI, is that like CSI on TV?
Not at all, no.
Tell the jury how it's not like it is on TV.
So, for example, on TV, I watched an episode once where they pulled a perfect fingerprint, I mean, full detail, and then instantly ran it, and the system found a match without any work needed. The actual process is a lot more complex than that. So a lot of the details are basically exaggerated. It's a lot more timely to get results, basically based on, lab tests and so on.
Okay. And on CSI, on the TV show, those guys do everything. They investigate the scene, they go out and catch suspects, all that good stuff. Are you involved in determining suspects or finding suspects?
No part of basically my job is purely objective, not subjective. So all I do is look at the evidence, and that's it.
Now, in this case, on February 2nd, looks like you arrived there about 12:31. Is that correct?
That sounds about right, yes.
And obviously, by the time you arrived, there was an active crime scene, correct?
Yes.
And by the time you arrived, there were police officers on scene.
Yes.
There were uniform officers of various degrees and levels in the police force, correct?
Yes.
And there were also detectives on scene, correct?
Correct.
And those detectives, were they assigned to the homicide unit?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when you arrive on the scene, do you take over the scene, being a CSI person?
So the crime scene is delegated to us. It is the main responsibility of us to process that crime scene, although it is a team effort as well. Okay.
Now, you say the team, you, along with other people who were actually there with CSI that day, correct?
Yes.
Because I believe on that particular day, also CSI Lester was with you.
That is correct, yes.
CSI Lester was also a crime scene investigator at the time.
Correct.
And on that particular date, you were the senior and they were the junior.
Not necessarily senior, junior. We kind of label it as primary, secondary. We actually started on the exact same day, so we were on equal footing for sure. But basically, the primary is delegated to take the photographs and collect the evidence of the scene, whereas the secondary is delegated to do the sketch and do a digital recording of the scene.
Like particularly in this case, we have the diagram, and the diagram has H. Lester at the bottom. And that was part of Lester's duties, right? In order to do the diagram?
Yes, that's correct.
The diagram is done basically taking measurements on scene, correct?
Yes.
They do like a rough sketch on scene, correct?
Yes.
And then often they go back to the office and do a nice, more formal, prettier diagram.
That is exactly correct.
And that's what happened in this case?
Yes.
Okay. But as you mentioned, you being the primary, a lot of your duties involve taking photographs.
Yes.
And in this case, Ms. Pott asked you about processing. In processing, that was primarily taking photographs, correct?
In this case, primarily taking photographs and collecting the evidence, yes.
Okay. And collecting the evidence. And again, let's talk about the evidence for a moment. There are a few placards in the house. And in the placard, we got evidence placard 1. And looks like we have the birth certificate, which you've already been introduced, correct?
Yes.
And you recall that there was also a large envelope on the kitchen counter with other various items inside, correct?
Looking, kind of reviewing what that item was, it appears that the birth certificate was basically attached to two other documents in that same kind of enclosure.
Okay. And then evidence 2, that's the block where we see the kitchen knives.
Correct.
And as you noted, it looks like it appears though this, I think was it 6 or 8? I think it was 8, and 1 was missing, correct?
I couldn't recall to the number, but the top left, where the chef's knife would go, that was the missing one.
Correct. And evidence 3, that's the black knife handle which you find downstairs.
Yes.
Okay. And evidence 4, that's the dumbbell, which you have right there in front of you, correct?
Correct.
And evidence 5, it looks like that's the placard where you have the area adjacent where there appears to be an impression in the floor, presumably, possibly from the dumbbell, correct?
Possibly, correct, yes.
And that's why you took the photo, because you said, oh, there's an impression in the floor, dumbbells are heavy, 35 pounds in this case, and is likely caused that impression in the floor.
Correct.
Oh, my apologies. I'm trying to stay awake this afternoon. I'm just talking too fast. I apologize. And so those are the placards in which you noted for us, correct?
Yes.
And we have about 20 or 30 photos, but that's not the full extent of the photos you took, correct?
Not the full extent, no.
Because obviously this was, as you said, a large house.
Yes.
We're talking a house in excess of 5,000 square feet. Is that fair to say?
Fair to say, yes.
And many bathrooms, many bedrooms.
Correct.
And many common areas also.
For sure, yes.
For sure. And so we have a portion of the photographs, and you took photos of that door which leads from the garage, I guess, up to the laundry room, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And did you take photos of the rest of the doorways?
Not that I recall, no. We observed that to the best of my recollection, once we entered through the garage, we observed that the rest of the doorways were locked, and that there didn't appear to be any damage to the frame or the door jamb from the outside and inside of the house. So we didn't, not that I recall, open those doors.
Okay. Now, that doorway leading from the garage into the house, you took photographs of it. Did you do any other processing of it?
No other processing of it, no.
And particularly, did you examine the doorknob, the door jamb, the lock strike, or any items for fingerprints?
We did not dust them for fingerprints, just for the sake that basically at that point the first responding officers had entered the home, the detectives had entered, the family member that found the decedent also entered. So basically the judgment call on that, we call it overlapping matrices as far as fingerprints go. So basically as so many hands touch the doorknob, basically there's going to be so many overlapping of the friction ridges that consist of the fingerprint that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to basically get a clear fingerprint off of that doorknob.
Okay. Did you even attempt it?
It was not attempted, no.
Okay. And likewise, I guess for the same reason, no one attempted to take any DNA from that particular area, the door, the doorknob, the walls around there.
For that same reason, yes, because there would be multiple DNA profiles.
What about in the kitchen area, around that block, though? Were there anyone try to get any DNA or fingerprints from around that kitchen block, where presumably the knife was taken from?
There was not any DNA or fingerprints taken from the kitchen area either.
Okay. In the downstairs area, like along the walls, because basically we're talking a staircase that goes down, and then we have Ms. Merritt found there at the bottom. Along the rails or the walls, was any fingerprints or DNA or anything taken in that area?
No, in that area, no, there were not any fingerprints or DNA taken. Okay. Along the walls, you said, right?
Yes, sir.
Right, so yeah, no DNA or fingerprints taken from that area.
Okay, so, but you mentioned to us, and we have before you, the knife handle and also the dumbbell. And those items, how were they preserved? Evidentiary values.
So the knife block was packaged in a paper bag, and the dumbbell was also packaged in several layers of paper bags because of the weight of it, so that it wouldn't bust through. And the purpose of that is to prevent cross-contamination, so that as long as there's basically a barrier from the inside to outside, nothing can contact the item on the inside of that bag. That is how we typically go about preserving evidence.
Now, on scene, I believe it's, given what you told us, I assume you're wearing gloves, right?
Yes.
And on scene, did you attempt to get any DNA or fingerprints or anything like that from those items?
Not from those items, no. What the judgment call on while we were on the scene, what we had decided as a team, was that we would preserve the items to send to GBI for testing. We wanted to, more so, it is best practice to send them the entire item rather than just a swab of it. So that way GBI can do all sorts of additional tests rather than, basically they have the whole item as compared to just a little swab of an area.
Now you say as a team, who's a part of this team making the decision?
Primarily ourselves, myself and Investigator Lester, as well as the homicide detectives. Detective McQuilkin was one of the main detectives that worked with us on the scene.
Okay. Now, let's talk about a couple of other things in which you took photographs of and maybe even collected. There was, I understand it was an Apple iPad with a purple case. You recall that?
Yes.
And what was done with that item?
That item was seized during the search warrant. So Detective McQuilkin actually, I photographed it and documented it, but Detective McQuilkin collected that item.
Okay. Also understand there was an Apple iPad with a black case and charger. Likewise, that item collected?
Exact same scenario. I documented it and Detective McQuilkin collected it.
I believe also there was a Kindle with a black case. Was that also collected? Kindle
with the black case. I would have to refer to my report to make sure that was also part of it.
If I can approach, Judge?
Yes.
Yes, there was a Kindle with a black case collected, documented by myself and collected by McQuilkin as well.
And likewise, do we have recall collecting some letters on top of a nightstand?
Yes, the handwritten letters.
You recall collecting a laptop? Dell laptop?
Yep, the laptop as well. All of those were also collected by McQuilkin.
Okay. Now, when you say those were collected by McQuilkin, did they remain in his custody or did they go to someone else's custody?
So at that point, he would be responsible for the custody of it entirely, as far as the packaging, the transportation, making sure that it is free from cross-contamination, as well as other personnel getting their hands on it. So he would be entirely responsible for those items.
Now, those particular items, to your knowledge, was any preliminary testing done on the scene, again, for fingerprints or blood?
Not for those items, no.
Okay, I mean DNA.
I do not believe so, no.
Okay. Now, you tell us about the dumbbell and the possible impression left in the carpet downstairs. Recall that?
Yes.
And because primarily the upstairs area, there was a lot of hardwood. There was some marble tile. There was also some carpet. But primarily downstairs, it was carpeted area, correct?
Primarily, yes.
Okay. Now, so when you were downstairs and you saw that impression that the dumbbell may have left, did you take the time in order to do any footprint impressions to see if there was a particular shoe that may have caused or walked from one room to the other?
We did examine the carpet entirely for other such impressions, but we did not see any impression that would resemble a shoe print or anything of the sort. Just that was the only one that stuck out, so that was the one that was documented.
Now, you noted on the second that it appears as though that there was not just blood but hair on the floor. Correct?
Hair on the floor, you said?
Mm-hmm. In the basement area.
In the basement area. I believe it would have been hair in that general area where the decedent was found.
Okay. Because it looks like you noted 35-pound dumbbell with suspected blood and hair.
Yes. Okay. So the hairs were on the dumbbell. Basically, they were. So where the blood was on the dumbbell, there were also hairs that were basically embedded in that dried blood.
And those particular hairs, how were those processed by you?
So as far as what we were able to do at Gap County crime scene, we did not have the capabilities or the training to test those hair samples. So what we were mainly responsible for was preserving them so that we could send it to GBI, where they have the capability to then test it. So just like routinely out of all of our other evidence, we would make sure that it's free from cross-contamination so that nothing could tamper with the evidentiary value of it, and it would then be sent to GBI.
And from what I see here, it looks like that you were there on scene to about 3:42. Does that sound correct?
That sounds about correct, yes.
About 3 hours and some change?
Yes.
Now, was that the extent of your involvement on February 2nd?
I believe I took some follow-up photographs of the evidence that I collected. But as far as that day for the original scene, that was the extent of my involvement on that day.
Okay. And you just led right to where I'm headed. You recall around about February 26th, taking some follow-up photos?
February 26th, if that's the date on the report, yes.
Okay. And when you took follow-up photos, where were you?
In the in our lab area of the crime scene unit.
And at that particular time, what were you tasked with doing?
At that particular time, we basically, in case that the photographs didn't turn out clear or anything like that, basically, or if additional photos were needed, we would take basically additional photos from all angles in the lab just to make sure that every bit of it was documented.
Now, the additional photos appears though you took photos again of the birth certificate and the paperwork.
Yes.
And it looks like you also took photos of that knife handle, correct?
Yes.
And also pictures of that 35-pound dumbbell with the suspected blood and hair, correct?
Yes.
So on that second time in which you processed those items, at that time, did you do any swabbing or smears or attempted fingerprints?
At that time, it was already decided that the items would be going to GBI, and it's a preferred policy that we don't tamper if it is being sent to GBI, to basically not mess with it at all on our end, so that way GBI can have it tamper proof and they can basically start their processing from ground zero.
So to your knowledge, after February 26th, were you involved with DKPD in the processing of any of these items?
No, I was not.
Nothing further, thank you.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
May the witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right, your next witness.
Your Honor, they call Jesse Worley.
I do. My name is Jessie Worley, Jesseworley.
Good afternoon, Ms. Worley.
Good afternoon.
Where do you work, ma'am?
I work at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation in the Division of Forensic Sciences, or the Crime Lab, in the Impressions Evidence section.
And your title there, what do you do?
My title is a crime lab scientist, and I am signed off to do latent print and footwear casework.
Okay. And your duties with the GBI, can you describe them?
Yes. So as a latent print examiner, our section accepts evidence from crime scenes that they've processed for latent prints or fingerprints. We also accept items of evidence that need to be processed to develop fingerprints on them. and we conduct comparisons to known fingerprint exemplars and do database searches on the state and federal fingerprint databases.
And what's your education?
I have a bachelor's of science in forensic and investigative sciences from West Virginia University.
Okay. And in order to become a latent print examiner, what kind of training do you have to have?
I completed the GBI's training program for latent prints and for footwear. Both training programs are about 2 years long. They cover all the topics we need to know to do the basic analysis for casework, as well as the history of the discipline. And then also we cover competency testing and then report writing.
John, can I approach? I just want to... That should be better. Okay, I think I asked about your training. And how long have you done this work?
I was hired at the GBI in 2007 and started working fingerprint cases at the very beginning of 2009, and then went through footwear training in 2020 and just finished that up last year. But I've continued to work fingerprint cases basically the last 15 years.
All right. Approximately how many fingerprint cases do you think you've worked?
A lot. I've averaged about 20 cases a month since I started working cases.
All right. And have you ever testified as an expert?
I have.
How many times?
Today might be 73. Would be 73.
Okay. And Your Honor, at this time we would move to admit Ms. Worley as an expert in latent print examination.
Any objection? She will be so recognized.
All right. Did you prepare a report for this case?
I did.
Okay. Now, when the GBI gets a case, what happens on the front end?
Any evidence that comes into the GBI, the agency that's submitting it is required to properly package and label their evidence and fill out a GBI evidence submission form to turn in with the evidence so that we can open and generate a case in our system so that we can track all of the items of evidence and the requested testing services. We also track the chain of custody for each item as it moves throughout our laboratory system, and that's where we generate our reports.
Okay. And for this case, was like a number created?
Yes. So every case that comes in from an agency is given a unique GBI or Division of Forensic Sciences case number, and then each item is numbered and tracked with that case. All
right. And for this case, can you just say what the case number was?
The DOFS case number was 2019-1005039.
Okay. Now, as it relates to latent print examination, did the GBI receive any items for that?
Yes.
What was received?
The item that was submitted with a request for latent print processing was a seal package containing a black plastic knife handle.
I'm showing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 48. Some gloves as well.
Thank you.
Can you look through that item and say what that is?
Yes.
Do you recognize that?
I do.
What is it?
This was the knife handle that was submitted from DeKalb County to be processed for latent prints.
Okay. And how do you know that it's the same item?
When we enter cases at GBI, everything gets barcoded. The barcode label has the case number, and then each item has its own unique item number. In this instance, State's Exhibit 48 appears as item 4 in the crime lab reporting system. And then I also hand wrote and dated on the package as well as the item itself.
Okay. Now, obviously, it's been opened today, but when you got it for testing, did it appear that the item had been tampered with?
No.
Okay. Now, what were you asked to do with the item?
The item was submitted with a request for latent print processing, which means that we would attempt different chemical or physical detection methods to try and develop fingerprints on the surface of that item.
Okay, and can you just describe the process that you would put an item through in order to try to get a print? Yes.
So the first step in any fingerprint processing protocol that we would do at GBI would be to conduct a visual examination. We do two things during this first step. One, we're assessing the item of evidence to determine what the surfaces are made out of, what kind of components exist on that item, so that we can apply an appropriate processing protocol. And then we're also looking to see if there are any fingerprints that might be visible before we attempt any methods. Throughout our process, if at any point we do observe or see something that could be usable for a comparison, we would use digital camera system in order to photograph and preserve that evidence.
Okay, and is this process generally accepted in this area of expertise?
Well, the processing that I applied to this item, it's a black plastic handle, so it's a mostly non-porous surface. So the typical processing protocol for non-porous items would be to use super glue fuming and then possibly also a dye stain. In this instance, I did the visual examination and the super glue fuming.
Okay. And I think I kind of jumped the gun here. What are latent prints?
So latent prints, everyone has what we refer to as friction ridge skin on the palm sides of your hands, as well as also the bottoms of your feet. You have basically raised portions of skin that form the ridges, and then there are valleys or furrows in between. The ridges on your hands and on your fingers basically flow in concert together, but there are different formations within that flow of ridges. Individually, the ridges start and stop or split into two in different places, and it's those placement of all those features that are unique to each individual. What we look for when we do fingerprint work is to see if when someone handled an item, that arrangement of features is reproduced on the surface, kind of like if you have a rubber stamp and you put ink on it and then you stamp onto a piece of paper. That's kind of how a fingerprint works. You've got sweat or oil or dirt or residue that's on the surface of your hands, and when you handle something, you transfer and make an impression of those features on another item.
Okay. Now, which of the processes did you do on the knife handle?
As I stated, I did a visual examination and then super glue fuming.
Okay. And what were the results?
The results of my testing in this case were negative.
Okay. Now, what does that mean?
So with our policy at GBI, our determination of whether an item has positive results comes down to how many of those features we can see. If a fingerprint or a latent print develops, we have to have at least 7 to say that it's positive. So in a case where something is negative, it can mean a couple of different things. It can be that there was no development of super glue on that item at all, period. It could be that the whole surface produced a reaction, and so nothing can be seen because there's just a total overall reaction. Or it can be that there are areas that could have been fingerprint or palm print detail, but they're not clear, they're obscured because they overlay one another, or there's just a general lack of clarity.
Okay. Now, for this item here, the texture of the knife or of the knife handle itself, would that play any part in whether or not you could get a latent print?
It could. Fingerprint details are very small, so if you have a surface that has texture that is very small as well, it can interfere with how clearly those details are reproduced or how clearly you can discern them as an examiner from one area to another, just by interfering and breaking up the flow or the continuity of the ridges that are on the surface.
Okay, and this surface, can you just describe as to what it is?
In this case, the surface was the plastic knife handle, so it did have some texturing to it.
Okay. I think that you had used the term non-porous.
Yes.
Okay. Other than the texture of the item itself, are there any other factors that could impact the ability to obtain a latent print?
Yes, there are a number of different things that could impact that.
What are they?
So starting with the person who's handling the item, if your hands have been freshly washed or your skin is very dry, there's not necessarily a lot of residue on the surface to actually impact a transfer. If your skin or your ridges are less robust, maybe your skin is a little older, it's lost a little elasticity, the ridges tend to be a little shorter, a little more softened, they don't record or reproduce as well in fingerprints. The surface of the item, like I said, texture versus something smooth can impact how well a print can be seen. The type of material it is can play a part. Like I said, this is a non-porous item. Non-porous surfaces are typically non-absorbent, so any residue that makes up a fingerprint is just sitting on the surface and is very delicate, and it's could be easy to destroy or damage that fingerprint until it's processed. The way an object is handled, if you think about it in terms of like things that are a tool, they're meant to be handled in a specific way. So if one person handles it and then another person handles it in the same manner, the second person's prints may be erasing or obliterating those of the first. And just overlaying on top of them. And so you're taking away from the clarity that could be observed.
Okay. So there's a lot of factors at play in whether or not you can obtain a print.
Yes.
All right. Every time you do this process, do you always obtain a print?
No, not always.
Now, I want to show you a photo of State's Exhibit 32. Can you take a look at that? What is that?
State's Exhibit 32 is a photograph of a 35-pound weight.
Okay. Now, the grip of the dumbbell, what kind of surface is that?
This one appears to be made out of metal. It may have some sort of clear coating to keep the metal from rusting, but it looks like the handle also has some texturing, probably to improve grip.
Would the grip itself be a texture that you would expect to get a print from?
We may see development if it were to be processed, but it wouldn't be I wouldn't expect to see very clear, usable fingerprint detail.
Okay, so the fact that you got a negative result on the knife handle, does that mean that the knife handle wasn't touched?
No, not necessarily.
What does it mean then?
It just means that there wasn't any detail that was clear enough to be used to do a comparison to known exemplars.
I have no further questions, Judge.
Cross.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
And you did your examination of this particular item on what day?
The processing that I completed took place on May 27th, 2022.
Okay. And the item was received by the GBI on what day?
Our records indicate that it was received at the laboratory on May 23rd.
Now, how many days or I guess hours did you actually work on this particular item?
All of my analysis was completed in a single day. A typical super glue fuming run takes about a half an hour to 45 minutes to complete. Since my results were negative, there wasn't additional time spent to do imaging or photography. So the actual analysis from start to finish maybe took 2 hours total.
So the item was received by the GBI on May 23rd of 2022, correct?
Yes.
And it was received from the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office, is that correct?
Yes.
And you said you did your examination on the 27th.
Yes, sir.
And it looks as though you completed your report on that same day.
Yes, I did.
And you were telling us that there can be various reasons why you have negative results.
Yes.
And in this case, you mentioned to us that sometimes you have to have at least 7. I know you used to call them points. What do you call them nowadays?
The terminology we use are minutia.
Minutia. Okay. It was easier when we called them points. So you had to have at least 7 minutia, correct?
Yes.
But sometimes you don't have 7.
Right.
And that yields a negative result.
Yes.
Is that what happened here in this case?
It's possible. With negative results, we don't photograph anything that's negative, so it would be hard to say for sure. Not having an exact memory of this specific case from over a year ago now, or about a year ago, as far as what the actual conditions of it were.
Okay. So could you mention also that it could be that during the super glue fuming that there's no development?
Yes.
And so given what you're telling us, that you don't recall if that's why you had a negative result.
Right. We don't record the reason it's negative. If we had enough detail to render a positive result, all of that would be photographed. But in instances where we have a negative, it's simply recorded as being negative.
Okay. And as you mentioned, that there's sort of, I guess, 2 steps. I guess one is basically looking with your naked eye, or do you do it through a microscope?
We do have magnifying glass and lamps with magnifying glass available to use. Typically, no, not a microscope. But most of what we're looking at is done, yes, with the naked eye.
And I assume that in this case, when you look with your naked eye, you weren't able to make a determination.
Well, I did make a determination. The determination.
Super glue fuming.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Emmons just asked you about dumbbells. In this case, back in May of 2022, were you asked to examine a dumbbell?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. Were you asked to examine the item there in State Exhibit number 32?
Not to my recollection.
Thank you.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
May the witness be excused?
Yes.
Mr. Queen?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Call your next witness.
Your Honor, they call Kimberly Jewett.
I do. My name is Kimberly, Kimberly, Jewett, Jewett.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Where do you work?
I work for the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, Division of Forensic Sciences, commonly referred to as the State Crime Lab.
Okay. And how long have you worked there?
For 13 years.
And what's your title there?
I'm a microanalyst for the trace evidence section.
Okay. And as a microanalyst, what are your duties?
I analyze evidence that is small in size, usually requiring the aid of a microscope to examine it. So things like hair, fiber, gunshot primer residue, things like that.
Okay. And I think you said how long you've worked there. How long have you actually been a microanalyst there?
For all 13 years.
Right. And what kind of education do you have?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree in biology with a minor in chemistry from the University of West Georgia. I've completed 2 courses at the McCrone Research Institute in Chicago, Illinois, one on applied polarized light microscopy, the other on human and animal hair. I've completed a course at Hook College of Applied Sciences in Westmont, Illinois on hair analysis. I've completed a 12-month training program at GBI for hair analysis, a 6-week training program for fracture match analysis, and a 6-month training program for gunshot primer residue analysis.
Okay, and is that all the training that you've had to have in order to do this job?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, the processing of hair itself, how long have you done that?
I've done that for all 13 years, minus the 12 months of training.
Okay. Now, in the 13 years, how many cases of processing hair do you think you've worked?
Approximately 570.
Now, have you ever testified as an expert?
Yes,
How many
I have.
times?
50.
Okay. And Your Honor, at this time we would tend to her in as an expert in trace evidence and microanalysis.
Any objection?
No objection.
She will be so recognized.
All right. Now, Ms. Jewett, did the GBI receive items for trace analysis in this case in April of 2022?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Now, this case that we're talking about, is there a certain number that's assigned to this case?
There is.
What is that number?
If I can refer to my notes. 2019-1005039.
Okay. Now, when you receive when the GBI receives the hair for trace analysis, what happens?
So when the evidence is first received into the lab, a unique crime laboratory case number will be placed on each new case that comes in. Each new case or item that comes in will have a unique item number also associated with it. So those items will have a barcode placed on the item so we can track it as it goes through the lab. The items will also be imaged as it comes in, and all submitting documentation will also be scanned into the case file.
Okay. And what items did trace analysis receive in this case?
We received hair identified as recovered from the hand of Shirley Merritt and the known head hair of Shirley Merritt.
Okay. And how were these items packaged?
They were both packaged inside of a brown paper bag that was sealed with red evidence tape, and an initial was across the seal. Inside that brown paper bag were 2 Ziploc plastic bags. One of these Ziploc plastic bags was labeled as hair from the hand of Shirley Merritt. It was zipped closed and had a label over the top. The other Ziploc plastic bag was labeled as the known head hair of Shirley Merritt. It was also zip closed with a label over the top.
Okay. When the items were received, did they appear to have been tampered with or damaged in any way?
No, they did not.
Okay. Now, what was requested of you to be done with these items?
It was requested that I analyze the hair from the hand of Shirley Merritt, see if any of those hairs were suitable for comparison, and if they were, to compare them to the known head hair of Shirley Merritt microscopically.
Okay. And so that comparison, can you describe that process?
Yes. First, I began by looking at the hair identified as from the hand of Shirley Merritt. I did this visually and with a stereo microscope. A stereo microscope is a low-powered microscope going up to about 64 times magnification that has a greater working distance underneath and lets us see more external features of what we're examining. In doing this, I mounted all of the hairs that were identified as from Shirley Merritt, that we call questioned hairs, onto a labeled slide. That slide, or slides in this case, multiple, were examined under a stereo microscope and a compound light microscope. A compound light microscope is a higher magnification microscope, normally going from 100 to 400 times magnification. With this, it also uses transmitted light, so we're able to see more internal features of the hairs. So with this stereo microscope and compound light microscope, I go through each questioned hair and try to classify them as I can. So whether they're suitable for comparison, we attempt to determine a body origin they could have come from and an ancestry they could have come from. At that point, since there were hairs suitable for comparison from the hands, I then mounted the known head hair of Shirley Merritt. Those were also mounted on 2 labeled slides, examined under the stereo microscope and compound light microscope, so I can get to know the features that exhibit within the known hair. Once all of those are mounted, I put the questioned hair on a comparison microscope and the known head hair on a comparison microscope. A comparison microscope is 2 compound light microscopes that are connected by an optical bridge with a triocular head on top. So with this, I can put the slide of the questioned hair on one side, the known hair on the other, and I can see them in one field of view at one time. So each questioned hair that's suitable for comparison will be compared to the known hair standard of at least 25 hairs from root to tip. So each questioned hair is compared separately to the known. After that, I can draw a conclusion as to if they're consistent or inconsistent in microscopic characteristics.
Okay, so there's, to kind of break that down, there's multiple steps then.
Yes.
So the first step is to take the hair that was from the hand?
Yes.
Okay. And when you have that hair, you're looking at that hair to determine whether or not it's suitable for comparison?
Correct.
Okay. How many hairs did you have to work with?
The total number of hairs in this case were 25 hairs.
Okay. And of the 25 hair, well, actually, what would make a hair suitable for comparison?
It has to exhibit enough characteristics or features that a comparison can be known. So things like pigment that naturally exist in a hair should be present. Pigment is a granule that gives the hair its color, and that can change throughout the hair. So what the color is, does that color change? Also, do those granules, how do they distribute within the hair? Are they evenly distributed all the way through? Are they clumped together? Does that change throughout the hair? Things like that. So we get to know a lot just from the pigment. But other characteristics such as that, we have to have enough characteristics and features to be able to do a comparison.
Okay. Now, of the 25 hairs that you had, how many were suitable for a comparison?
8 of them.
All right. So the first step is determine how many are suitable?
Correct.
Right? And then the second step is to look at the known hair. Is that right?
After determining if they're suitable for comparison, then we can look at the known hair and get familiar with the known hair.
Okay. And you did that here?
I did, yes.
Now, of the 8 hairs that were suitable for comparison, what did you find?
In examining all of the hairs, I determined that there were hairs unsuitable for comparison and 8 hairs characteristic of European ancestry and characteristic of head hair that were suitable for comparison. Those 8 hairs compared to the known hair of Shirley Merritt were consistent in microscopic characteristics.
Okay. Now, I think you said what the factors were as far as what would make hairs unsuitable. Well, okay, so 8 hairs, of the 8 hairs, 8, they were all a match then?
They were all microscopically consistent to the known head hair, yes.
Okay. Now, of the remaining hairs that were unsuitable, what were some of the factors that you saw in this case that didn't allow you to proceed?
All of the hairs that I noted were white in color, and by white it means that it lacked pigment. So again, that's something we get a lot of information from is the pigment, what gives it its color. So since there wasn't any of that pigment, I wasn't able to do a comparison.
Okay. Now, after you finished this process, was there did you prepare a report?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and what is the date of your report?
The date is 5/18/2022.
Okay, and the findings on your report are the same that you just went through here?
They are.
Okay. Now, after you did the micro analysis on the hair, what do you normally do next?
Normally in a situation like this, I would be done because this is what we would consider not probative. So it's expected that you're going to find hair of an individual on that individual. We're not proving anything else. We already know she was there. A probative example would be if a subject's hair was found on a victim's clothes. victim's hair is found on subject's clothes. You're showing that someone was in contact with each other that you didn't necessarily know before. In those situations, we normally go a step further after a consistent result and send a route for nuclear DNA analysis.
Okay. And so here, what did you do next?
In this case, it was specifically requested that we send routes for nuclear DNA analysis, even though it's not our normal policy. So I went ahead to do that step.
Can you just describe that process?
Yes. In doing that, I look at the roots for a hair. That's the portion that would be suitable for DNA or nuclear DNA if it's possible. In looking for the roots, we have to determine if it's either anagen, which is an actively growing hair and a hair that has to somewhat be forced out, or a catagen-telogen hair, which is a hair that just naturally sheds. But if it's catagen-telogen, it has to have follicular tissue or skin still attached to the catagen-telogen hair. So if it has one of those two things, an anagen root or a catagen-telogen root with follicular tissue, it's suitable for nuclear DNA analysis. So anything that was suitable, in this case, all of the hairs were looked at. They were imaged as to how they appeared. They were cut and each of them placed into their own individual vials. They were made into new item numbers and sent to forensic biology for nuclear DNA analysis.
Okay. And you did that here?
I did.
All right. After you sent the items to the, what's the department again?
The forensic biology section?
The biology section. After you sent the items to the biology section, did you do anything else on this case?
I did not. That was the end of my examination.
I have no further questions, Judge. Thank you.
Wow.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now let's see here, Richard. I got a question for you. You mentioned that the case number is 2019-1005039, correct?
Correct.
And however, you just mentioned that the case was taken in on 4/28 of 2022.
The items that I received were taken in on 4/28/2022.
Now tell us why it appears as though there's a 2019 case number on items in which you examined in 2022.
The 2019 case number would be from whenever the very first item was submitted, and then the request was, or excuse me, the case was made. I can't say why these items weren't submitted until 2022. Only they were submitted on April 28th, 2022.
So was any examination done of these particular items in 2019 or 2020 or 2021 to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, not at the lab. None of item 2 for us, which is the hairs from the hand or the known head hair of Shirley Merritt, was examined in any way until then.
Okay. Now, again, we've already mentioned that on April 28th, the items were received from the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office, correct?
Correct.
And on what day did you do your examination, or was it over a course of days?
I began it on that same day, April 28th, 2022. The examination takes more than just a single day, so it didn't complete really until my report was released, which was May 18th, 2022.
Okay. And you were focused on the microanalysis of these pieces of hair.
From the hairs, correct.
Now hair, how many parts are there to hair?
So it depends on how you want to break it down. The structure of a hair, you could almost look at it like it's a pencil. So the pencil has paint on the outside, which is like the scales on your hair. The wooden part of a pencil would be like the main part or the cortex of a hair. And then the lead down the center would be like a medulla that we have at the center of your hair. A medulla is an air sac that runs down the center. It can be present or not in human hair. It can be translucent, which is see-through, or opaque, so you can't see through it. And then with animal hairs and things like that, it tends to be more structured. And then you have the tip of your pencil is like the very tip of your hair. And then the eraser part of the pencil is like the root of your hair. So that's the overall structure of a hair.
And when you were looking at those 8 that were suitable for comparison, what part of the hair were you looking at?
I'm looking at all of it from root to tip if the root is present. Some of these in this case did not have a root, so from the very top of it all the way down to the tip. We compare all of it all the way through.
Okay. Now with the other ones that were unsuitable, why were they unsuitable?
They were unsuitable because they didn't have any pigment in them. So pigment, again, is what gives the hair its color. That pigment exists in the cortex part I was talking about, or the wooden part of your pencil. So without any of that pigment that takes up so much of the middle cortex part of it, there's just not enough to really compare.
So comparing the eraser and the point's not good enough?
No, we actually have to have it consistent from root to tip, so all the features in each question hair fall within the range of the known that's exhibited.
Okay. And you mentioned that 8 were suitable and the unknown did match the known.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
The 8 which were suitable, you did compare those, correct?
The 8 that were suitable were compared to the known hair of Shirley Merritt, yes.
And consistent?
They were consistent.
Okay. Now, a second step you did, which is not, sounds like it's not what you always do.
Correct.
Is basically you look to see what was suitable to forward on to biology.
Correct.
And how many hairs were suitable for biology?
There were 18 hair roots that were suitable for biology.
Okay. Now, you're talking about the roots. So here we go talking about just the eraser, correct?
Yes, for forensic biology to do their analysis, they only need the root portion.
And why is that?
That's the only part that you're actually going to get any type of nuclear DNA off of it. The rest of the portion, no matter how many studies have been done, that's not really possible. There's another type of DNA technique that can potentially test that, and it's called mitochondrial DNA. It is not specific to an individual. It is passed from mother to child in an exact replica, and it's not something that we do at GBI. It's something that would have to go for FBI to do, and the FBI does not accept all of the cases that we send in. Something like that, there's a microscopical comparison that says it's consistent with this person, and having so many things from DNA, nuclear DNA analysis, I don't think they would actually accept this. Also, if we send something for mitochondrial DNA, it is destructive to the hair, and nothing can be done with it after that point.
Okay. So we went down that road, and let's get back where we were.
Okay.
You tell us about the root, and the root goes on to biology, correct?
Correct.
And they do DNA testing on it.
They do.
And is that anything you're involved in?
No. Once I cut the roots and send it, I have no further interaction with the case.
And in this particular matter, it appears though after, I guess, was it June 1st, which you were last involved in this case?
Yes, my last report was June 1st, 2022.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes.
Any redirect?
Just real briefly, Judge. Ms. Stewart, of all the micro analysis of hair that you've done, have you ever had a hair sample from a decedent's hand that belonged to somebody who wasn't the decedent?
In my experience, no. The cases I've worked where hair from the hand of a victim has always been consistent microscopically to the victim's known hair.
I know for the question, Judge.
Anything further, this witness? May the witness be excused?
Yes, Judge.
Mr. Queen?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Call your next witness.
Your Honor, the state calls Alexandra Jason.
Thank you.
Raise your hand. Swear to tell the testimony.
I do.
Please state your name.
Yes. My name is Alexandra Jason, Alexandra, and Jason is Jasin.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Where do you work?
I work at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, or known as the GBI, in the Division of Forensic Science in the Biology Department.
Okay. And how long have you worked there?
3 years.
And what's your title there?
I'm a forensic DNA analyst.
What does that mean?
I receive evidence from state and local agencies and do DNA analysis on them.
Okay. And I think I asked, but how long have you worked there?
3 years.
3 years. Okay. Now, what type of education do you have?
I got my bachelor's in forensic biochemistry in 2019 from Northern Michigan University.
Okay. And in order to become or to work in the forensic biology department, what kind of training do you have?
I underwent an extensive training that included oral, written, and practical examinations, as well as a supervised casework period.
Okay. And how many cases of DNA typing have you worked?
Around 100.
Okay. And have you ever testified as an expert?
I have.
Okay. And approximately how many times?
10.
Right. Your Honor, at this time we would tender in Ms. Jason as an expert in the field of forensic biology and DNA.
Any objection? She will be so recognized.
Thank you, Judge. Ms. Jason, what is DNA?
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's the blueprint that makes us who we are. We get half of it from our mom, half of it from our dad, and it's unique to each individual with the exception of identical siblings.
Okay. And how, like, when you perform testing on DNA and to get DNA, how do you do that?
So we start with the extraction process, which is where we take a portion of the sample and using chemicals are able to isolate the DNA molecule from the rest of the cellular components. From there, we move on to the quantification process, which is where we determine how much DNA was extracted. From there, we make millions and millions of copies of specific sections of the DNA, which is called amplification. From there, we use computers and instruments in order to separate and detect those segments of DNA to make a graph, which we call the DNA profile. And from there, I compare to any known individuals from the case. I write my report and come to testify.
Okay. Now, as it relates to this case, I think we've been through this already, but is there a certain case number that's assigned to each case?
Yes.
Okay. Now, was the case number for this case 2019 1005039?
Yes.
Okay. Now, as it relates to that case number and any request for DNA, what were you asked to do?
I was asked to do the data analysis for hair samples and for contact swabs on a dumbbell.
Okay. A dumbbell.
Dumbbell. Yep.
Let's talk about dumbbell first. What contact swabbing? What is that?
So contact DNA is just when you touch something, you typically leave skin cells behind. So we can swab that area that we suspect has been touched to see if we can get a profile from it.
Okay. What items did the GBI have at this time?
Just in relation to this case, I believe we had the hairs and we had the dumbbell.
Okay. Do you know who submitted those items?
No, but I can look at the chain of custody to find out.
Can you? Yeah.
May I refer to my notes?
Yes.
Thank you. We received the dumbbell from the DeKalb County District Attorney.
And what date did you get the dumbbell?
May 26th.
Okay. Now, when the dumbbell was received by the GBI, what was done in order to do any DNA testing on it?
A swab was taken. It was a wet swab, what we call a wet swab, and a dry swab was taken of the handle of the dumbbell.
Okay. So, what, like a piece of cotton was?
Yeah, typically it looks like a Q-tip, a one-sided Q-tip.
Okay. And so it was swabbed.
Correct.
And is the process that you described earlier, as far as DNA typing, the same that you would do on the contact?
Yes.
DNA? Okay. Now, did you do anything with the swab on the dumbbell?
No, once it's swabbed and then it's tested, so
Right.
starts the extraction, we just put it back in the envelope and it's returned to the agency.
Was it tested?
Yes.
Okay. What were the results of the testing on the swab from the dumbbell?
It was insufficient. So there was DNA, but there was not enough to move forward to the amplification process.
Okay. Insufficient?
Yes.
What does that mean?
It just means that we detected that there was DNA present, but we need a certain amount in order to move forward to amplification.
Okay. So there was DNA there, just not enough to create a profile?
Correct.
All right. Now, what type of material would you be most likely to get a good DNA sample off of? Or yeah.
When it comes to contact DNA, it's best when there's a sample that can, or an item that has a lot of friction with it. So the more ridges, if it's a cloth-like material, so that you could have absorption, are the best items or the best materials to have.
What about how often an item has been used?
Yep, how often item's been used, how often it's cleaned or washed, how recently it's been cleaned or washed, and different environmental factors. Is it left outside? Is it protected? Things like that.
Okay. And so here there was an insufficient amount of DNA to go through further testing. Was there anything sent to you to compare it against anyways?
Yes, we had a known from Shirley Merritt and a known from Richard Merritt.
Okay. Now, that result, the insufficient amount of DNA, do you always receive a full profile?
No.
Okay. How often do you not get one?
It's hard to say. We don't really keep statistics of a percentage of how often, but we do typically not like to test contact DNA because we know the likelihood of getting one is still pretty low.
Okay. So it's common. Is it common to have gotten this kind of result then?
Yes.
The fact that there was an insufficient amount of DNA, does that mean that the item had never been touched?
No, because we did get some DNA. The instrument still detected that there was DNA there, just not enough for us to move forward.
Okay, so we can say that it was used?
Yes.
Now, the hairs themselves, what were you asked to do with any hair?
The hairs also went through the DNA analysis process.
Okay. And what were you asked to test? What items?
We had 18 hairs that were submitted for DNA, and so they all went through the DNA process.
Okay. And did you have items to compare any DNA profile that you received from the hair?
Yes, we had the knowns from Shirley Merritt and Richard Merritt.
Okay. And the same process that was done with the dumbbell to create a profile and test it against that profile, was that done with the hair as well?
Yes.
And were the hair roots tested?
Yes, the hair roots were tested and they were compared if they moved forward to get a profile.
Okay. Now, of the hair roots that were tested, did you get any profiles?
Yes.
Okay. What were the results of your testing?
Out of the 18 hairs, 11 of them we got a profile from, and one was insufficient for DNA, so like the dumbbell, it didn't move forward to amplification, and one was absent for any DNA.
Okay, let's talk about the 11 roots that had a profile. Can you talk about those?
Yes, so out of those 8 of them had a full profile that I matched to Shirley Merritt, and then 3 of them had partial profiles that I matched to Shirley Merritt.
The 5 where DNA was obtained, but you had a limited data. What does that mean?
Yes, so those were inconclusive, or what we call inconclusive. We got DNA profiles or partial profiles possibly from them, but I couldn't make any conclusions because the amount of DNA there or the profile was still so small.
Okay. And I think you said that there was one root that had an insufficient amount of DNA to move forward?
Correct.
And that's like the dumbbell?
Yes.
All right. And then one had an absence of DNA. What does that mean?
There's just no DNA detected from the hair being extracted.
Does that mean that it didn't come from someone's head? What does that mean?
It could mean a different amount of things. It could have just been a bad hair root. Typically, we don't like contact DNA. We don't typically like doing hair because it doesn't give you a lot of DNA. We're only testing, it's not like you're getting a clump of hair that we're testing. It's one single root, and there's just not a lot of DNA held within the root of that hair.
Okay. After the hair has been processed, is there anything left?
No. When it comes to hair analysis, we consume the entire hair.
Okay. I have no further questions, Judge.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
And you did this process in April of 2022?
Correct.
Now, you were telling us that over time, DNA deteriorates. It can deteriorate, correct?
It can deteriorate over time, yes.
Why and how?
Different factors, again, kind of like with evidence. When it comes to environmental factors, say it's left out in the sun for long periods of time, UV destroys DNA. Also, like cleaning things, bleach, stuff like that can also destroy DNA.
Now, in this case, one of the things you examined was a dumbbell, correct?
Correct.
And this dumbbell, prior to you doing testing on it in April of 2022, do you have any idea where it was stored, how it was stored, or who it was stored by?
The dumbbell, when it was received by the GBI, was properly sealed and packaged. And from that point, it was kept in a few different storage locations within the GBI, including in the biology lab.
Now, that's when it was in your possession, GBI possession. What about
Correct.
before that? Any idea how it was stored or packaged before that?
No, I can't speak to how the dumbbell was packaged or anything like that before it got to the lab.
Okay. Now, you mentioned contact DNA, and of course, contact, that's like me touching this podium, correct?
Correct.
What about blood? Blood on that dumbbell?
There was blood on the dumbbell, yes.
And was it tested?
The blood was tested for serology, but it was not DNA tested.
Okay. Any idea why?
It wasn't requested.
Now, contact, blood, where does sweat fall into this?
Well, sweat kind of helps the skin cells that rub off when we touch things through friction to help kind of just stick and absorb to whatever it touches.
Okay. Now, is there any idea if there may have been some sweat on the dumbbell?
We don't test for that.
Okay. And why is that?
I honestly don't even know how we would test for sweat. Sweat is just the oils that come from your hand and precipitation. It's not necessarily, it's just not something we test for.
Okay. And you mentioned to us also you tested the hairs.
Yes.
And actually, in both cases, you had knowns from Richard Merritt and Shirley Merritt, correct?
Correct.
And as to the hairs, you did find some that were consistent with the DNA profile of Ms. Shirley Merritt.
Correct.
And I guess, just to be clear, in both cases, regarding the dumbbell, regarding the hairs, you found no DNA consistent with Richard Merritt.
Correct.
Thank you.
Any redirect?
Just briefly, Judge. The fact that you didn't find a profile matching Mr. Merritt, does that mean that he didn't touch it?
No, there was DNA there, so someone touched it.
I have no further questions, Judge.
Any further questions of this witness?
No, Your Honor.
May the witness be excused?
Yes, Judge.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Call your next witness.
Your Honor, we'd ask to resume tomorrow. Our next witness is going to testify.
Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we made some really good progress today. I'm going to ask you all to please be back at 9 a.m. tomorrow. We'll continue on with the testimony. If you'll meet the deputy out in front of 7A as you did when you came back from lunch. The refrigerator and the microwave and anything that's in the jury room is for your use during the course of the trial. So if you want to bring in snacks or anything like that, feel free to do so. I know it gets a little difficult in the afternoons to stay awake and pay attention, but it is very important that you pay close attention to the evidence. You're not going to have a transcript or anything of the testimony back when you begin your deliberations. So if anyone needs a break, and I try to keep an eye out for anyone dozing off, but if I miss you and you need a break, just please raise your hand and let me know, okay? And we'll take as many breaks as we need to, because I want to make sure that you're paying close attention to the evidence. Please remember the instruction not to talk about the case or allow anyone to talk to you about the case, all right? Have a nice evening, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you. All right, anything we need to address before we recess?
Not from the state.
Oh, thank you, Judge.
Okay. All right, see you all at 9. The exhibits that have been admitted, if you all will put them all together, we can lock them up.
You're listening to the trial of Richard Merritt from the Hidden Killers podcast on the True Crime Today network. Press subscribe now and get ad-free episodes by upgrading to our premium experience through Apple Podcasts. More next.